Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We pick up where we left off the last time we were together. If you remember, we've been talking about the legal framework that is perhaps driving or supporting Imām al-Wāsiṭī's conclusions on musical instruments, singing, and such, especially in spiritual settings. And we read through his al-Bulgha wal-Iqnā'. And this is fi halli shubhati mas'alat as-samāʿ, which is basically talking about the doubt surrounding Sufi audition. We read through this together, looked at some of his insights, reflections, and experiences. And now we've circled back to close the chapter on this particular topic, for now at least, looking at the legal code according to the Hanabila. And if you remember, when we discussed the overview of the other opinions, it was by way of Imām al-Ghazali's Ihya ulūm-ud-Dīn. Even though he's of those that deem singing generally permissible under certain constraints, he does in his Ihya kind of mention the various schools of thought, the Hanafiya and the Malikiya and the Shafi'iyya, in regards to their particular view on the topic. Does not mention the Hanabila, and for that reason we're going over it here. And primarily because, of course, Imām al-Wāsiṭī rahimahullah ta'ala, Imād-ud-Dīn, when he moved to Damascus, and that's around the time that he authored most of his works, including this later on, as he was settled in Damascus among the Hanabila there, had adopted the particular madhab, had studied from their eminent scholars, and of course the work al-Kafi by Ibn Qudama, he had studied that and summarized it. So just to recap what we looked at in regards to the adala and its relationship to music, singing, dancing, and the like, we talked about the ruling of the Hanabila with musical instruments and that it being impermissible. And then the various different views in the madhab regarding singing. There were those that deemed it to be permissible, the minority within the school disliked, and then those that deemed it to be haram altogether. Singing, we're talking about singing now, not singing with music and bands, etc. Just singing. And then if you looked at the nature of the type of song or the environment in which it's done, those things create a layer of different rulings that you would have to also consider. Okay? In all cases, this is from Al-Mughni by Ibn Qudama, to kind of summarize or to wrap this up as it pertains to the person's adala, which is their moral standing, if you will. He says, whoever takes singing as a profession, performing for others or organizing performances, or acquires a male or female singer and gathers people to listen to them, his testimony is not accepted. So this is in the chapter of witnesses and testimonies, meaning your testimony would be rejected if this came to light, because it has to do with suqut al-muru'ah. On one end of the spectrum, it has to do with your suqut al-muru'ah is your character. It's a violation of upright character, as well as and that has something directly to do with the person's adala, which is a part of their being able to stand as a witness. Are they morally sound individuals? Okay? For according to those who do not prohibit it outright, such behavior is still considered frivolous. It's still considered safa. It's still considered base, dana'a, slowly, and a violation of character. This is suqut al-muru'ah. And for those who deem it prohibited, then in addition to being dishonorable, such a person is sinful, persisting and openly disobeying, or persistently and openly displaying disobedience and sin. Right? So he's basically making a distinction here between the school of thought that permits singing versus the school of thought that prohibits singing, and how that relates to a person's testimony is, regardless the school, the end conclusion is still the same. It would render your testimony invalid. Those that considered it permissible, they considered it, if you were doing as he described, as a profession, gathering people for these performances, hiring people or acquiring people in order to sing and have people come listen, then this is considered frivolous, base, and it is a violation of upright character. He goes on and he said, this is the view also held by Imām al-Shafi'i and the scholars of Ashab al-Ra'i. This is mainly like the scholars that oftentimes they say al-Ahnaf are of this category, al-Hanafiyya. He says, however, if he does not formally associate himself with singing and merely sings to himself without performing for others, or if his male or female servant only sings for him personally, then the ruling depends on the underlying disagreement regarding the permissibility of singing. Right? So then in that case, if it's just a personal thing that you engage in, the ruling is different based on which side of the spectrum you fall on. So according to those who permit it or merely deem it disliked, makruh, his testimony is not rejected. So these are like private settings, as opposed to the previous category, which is the public gatherings, the professionalism to it, the putting on shows. Either you're the performer or you hired performers. So now we're talking about a private setting. So according to those who permit it or merely deem it disliked, his testimony is not rejected. But those who prohibit it say, if he persists in it, his testimony is rejected, just as it would be for other minor sins. Just as it would be for other minor sins. That's the point that I'm mentioning this section here, this chapter of Al-Mughni and the other works, is to highlight the ruling of singing. The testimony and the impact that singing has on it is based on what the ruling of singing is. Right? Because your testimony can be rendered invalid for persistence in minor sins. Right? Someone that persists in minor sins is considered a fasiq. And in that case, they're not a valid witness, or they can't bear testimony. And so here, those that considered music to be impermissible, then it would have an impact on their testimony. If he does not persist, then his testimony is not rejected. So like, a one-off here or there. It's not a regular occurrence of minor sin, because in all honesty, we would be asking for the impossible at that point. When it comes to minor sins, they're things that are committed and are expected to be committed and should be framed in that light. But someone that is consistent and persistent in committing them means there's no remorse and there's no plan to rectify and remedy that situation. Sahib hawa, right? The person is just being led by their own desires. And he says if the one committing it believes it to be lawful, if they consider it to be halal, then by the school's methodological standards, his testimony is not rejected for something disputed and not widely known of him, just as is the case with other contested subsidiary matters. Right, so you would then consider sometimes the various different secondary, like al-furu', which are these issues which you'll find differing opinions across the schools of thought, and then you consider, is the person ascribed to this particular school? Because in that school they consider it just to be makruh. And then we'll work with the person based on that ascription. That's their school of thought. we'll take them based on that school of thought's rulings. And that's how you would deal with these things that are disputed, such that you have to consider there is area of scholarly debate that is accepted here, an acceptable level of debate. And so you would manage that level and how you're going to deal with a person in the event that they had to stand as a witness and give testimony. Again, back to that issue of like the lawyer is now trying to strike witnesses or is reviewing the witness panel and is going to strike. And he's going around and they're trying to figure out which are the most suitable witnesses, or maybe even this is the judge's job to determine which witnesses are suitable. And so these issues will come up. And the person might say, hey, I don't want him bearing witness or giving testimony here because he's a singer. I saw him singing or something. And then the judge's job might be to go, well, listen, what is your view on singing? And he says, well, I belong to the school of thought that permits singing. And then he goes, okay, well, if that's your school of thought, well, then we'll take your word for it on that. As for the one who frequents houses of singing, that's what they call them, bayut al-ghina. In the legal books, they call them houses of singing. You know what that means. They're the clubs. Going to the clubs. Or is frequented by singers for public listening. Maybe they don't go to the clubs, but they have performers come to them. Openly and repeatedly engaging in such behavior, then his testimony is rejected according to all of them, for such conduct is deemed frivolous and base. Again, that goes back to the concept that everybody agrees that doing this out in the open and publicly and regularly, consistently, this is considered a violation of honor and conduct. It's deemed frivolous and base. If the matter is ambiguous or private, then he is treated like one who sings to himself according to the details and distinctions I just mentioned. All right, so you have those levels. Professional involvement. Then you have the legal disagreements that you have to consider. And then you have the nature of their engagement in this particular act. That basically gives us a nice conclusion to Imām ibn Qudama's view, according to the Hanabila, on how singing impacts a person's testimony. And they didn't just stop at singing. They also addressed other forms of verbal expression, such as chanting poetry while traveling, especially with camels. And they call this al-Hida. You're familiar with that? Or al-Huda. Depends on, you can say it either way, al-Huda or al-Hida. And so they've considered this permissible. It's mubah. The Hida or Huda is a chanting of poetry. And this is based on a report from Aisha radiallahu anha. She said, we were with the Messenger of Allah on a journey, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha had a good voice for chanting, and he was with the men. And Jasha was with the women, one of the lady companions. So the Prophet ﷺ said to Ibn Rawaha, stir the people along. And so he began to chant in verse, and Anjasha followed him as well among the ladies. And so the camels, they began to pick up their pace and speed up. And when the Prophet ﷺ noticed that, he said to Anjasha, slow down and be gentle with the delicate vessels, al-qawarir, meaning the women. Because now the camels are starting to get going too fast, bumping them around, and a lot of times they're riding in the hoda, which is that pod that sits on top of the camel's back. So I will give you an example of this Hida so you can understand what it sounds like in comparison to singing so that we're not confused, right? And I found a great example online. It's a rare one. Yeah, it's hard to find these without music in them. Let's put this on here if we I like that. So this is the Hida or Huda. And they have similar chants. I mean, there's all different types of chants that people would say, or they just basically make it up. Some of them are known, some of them are just made up and freestyle, but that's basically what it's like. And the concept of it is that the camels react, and they still do that to this very day. I said that's not like some old recording, that's like somebody's recording of recent times. And you can find, if you're interested, you can go on YouTube and look that up. And you'll find various different people that are still involved in herding camels and driving them around. And this is one of the things that they utilize in order to like either call them, because the camels are unique animals in that they respond in certain ways that the camel herders are like very intrigued by. Of course, the camel's mentioned in the Quran in multiple verses, and so it's something that we can reflect upon, and especially in Arab culture and the Bedouin culture in particular, where camels have always been a big central part of that. This is obviously a pretty big deal, and we see it here being utilized during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and because of that, the Prophet ﷺ basically almost commanding that they utilize these audible tools, if you will, in order to move things along. It was deemed permissible, that is. And similar to the Hida is the Nashid al-A'rab. This is the poetic chanting of Bedouins as well. I couldn't find an example of that without music in it. Because today everybody's, you can't just listen to those things without music in today's society, because music has become so prevalent. And I didn't want to spend too much time looking around for it, having to listen to a lot of that stuff. But if you can imagine the Hida into something a little more perhaps refined, but still along the same sound, because the Bedouins, they have this kind of sound, especially if you're in the Arabian Peninsula. This is kind of a common sound and a common like tone, if you will. Then their chanting, the Nashid al-A'rab, would be similar to that. And the reason why I'm drawing your attention to this and kind of trying to push the point is to distinguish between a lot of the anashid that are studio produced today, where people are singing and then also having the voice mimic musical sounds, musical instruments. So where they think they're doing a workaround, we're saying, okay, we understand that the musical instruments are haram, whether it's a flute or a string instrument or any type of musical instrument minus the duf, the hand drum in certain scenarios. We understand those are impermissible, but we still want to have the music. We don't want to do the instrument, so what we'll do is we'll utilize the voice to mimic the sound of the instrument itself, right? And so the a cappella groups today, they do that. They'll have 1, 2, or 3 people singing the words, and then 3 or 4 people making the sound of the music itself, right? And so it's essentially the same thing when you do that. It's essentially the same thing, right? So the Nashid al-A'rab are one thing, and these studio produced nasheeds that are typically found and become very popular are another thing altogether. So this Nashid al-A'rab, the Bedouin chanting of poetry, this is also considered permissible, and there is no harm in it because it is similar, they say, to al-Hida, chanting to urge camels or travelers forward, because there's a close relation to the two. So that gives you an idea on one angle. Another angle is the ruling on poetry. And when we looked at Imām al-Wāsiṭī's al-Bulgha, he talked about reciting poetry and reproached the groups for the various different lines of poetry that they would recite. He had some very strong words, harsh words against them. So poetry within the legal framework of the Hanabila is like speech. Ḥajr, poetry, is like speech or kalam. Meaning the ruling is like that. So if it's good poetry, then it's good. If it's bad poetry, then obviously it's bad. And when we mean good and bad, we're not talking about like stylistically is it good or bad. We're talking about the contents of it, is it good or bad. So if it's immoral content, then it's going to be haram. Or it's going to be makruh, depending on what it is that's being said. Okay? So that gives you kind of an idea of how the ruling can change when it comes to reciting poetry based on what the poem actually contains, much like speaking. Right? When you speak, what you say is going to depend largely on the contents of what it is that you're saying. So your words could be beautiful words. When you say La ilaha illallah, very virtuous, very rewarding, even obligatory at times. There can be things that you say that are just mubah. You're talking about what you had for lunch. Then there are things that could be makruh or haram in what it is that you say. Right? And the same thing goes for poetry. And it's been narrated that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, poetry is like speech. It's good is like good speech, and it's bad is like bad speech. So the composition and writing and recitation of poetry is permissible as a ground level ruling, as a baseline. And that's because the Prophet ﷺ, another example of this, is that the Prophet ﷺ had poets from the companions. And the poets, they would come to him and he would listen to them, ﷺ. So you can see here the poetry, of course, that Imām al-Wāsiṭī, we're going to take a look at that again as a review, that he was speaking so harshly against was poetry that the contents of it was not good. Some of it was quite lewd and illicit, or at least insinuating that which is illicit. All right, so that's what we can find in Imam Ibn Qudama's work regarding the matter of testimony. If we now push forward to be thorough and have a good understanding of where the madhab is today, in Sharh Muntal Iradat, in the chapter of offering testimony, Imam al-Buhuti, you recognize Imam al-Buhuti from Umdatul Talib, he writes that the second condition that is considered for a person's uprightness or their adala is the practice of dignified conduct, which is muru'ah. Muru'ah, this is dignified conduct. It's their humanity, their noble character. And this is shown by acting in ways that beautify and adorn a person customarily, such as good manners, generosity, using one's influence for the benefit of others, or being a good neighbor, and similar traits. This is muru'ah. This is a part of your religion, by the way. Obviously, we can see here from the different conditions for you to be considered adil, like an upright person, you have to be a person of muru'ah. You have to have a good conduct. You have to be of noble character. And you can undermine that by doing the opposite. Having poor manners, being stingy, being ill to your neighbor, etc. He says, and it includes avoiding actions that disagree and disgrace and dishonor a person based on custom, such as base and degrading behavior. And therefore, he gives some examples of that. Someone who, for example, makes a mockery of themselves. Someone who dances excessively. Raqas. And this is important because Imam al-Wāsiṭī highlights them dancing in their gatherings at times. They would get together, they would begin their samāʿ, and then they would start dancing. Sometimes twirling and spinning, sometimes just dancing around in these groups. And he mentions as well in the chapter of musabaqa, that's right, the musabaqa, which are like races and competitions, he notes explicitly that dancing is makruh. It's disliked. So that's the ruling on dancing. And so doing this, that's why it's not, here he's saying this is going to detract from your muru'ah, something that's disliked. If you start engaging in that, especially regularly, he says dances excessively, then raqas is the word that means a dancer, kind of. Not someone that just danced, but dances, like regularly. Right? Then this could disqualify you in that way. Or someone who performs sleight of hand trickery or conjuring acts like resembling sorcery, which is something that unfortunately the Muslim community has been plagued with in their gatherings with children and things of that nature. And they get together and they have their Eid parties and celebrations. They have to try and bring a magician to come and perform these little sleight of hand acts. So this is considered base and degrading behavior to bring and employ these people. Or someone who, as he says, is a singer. Such testimony is not accepted. Right? He says singing, this is in one section of the book, singing is disliked, makruh. Singing with a kasr, of course, ghina. And it refers to raising one's voice with poetry in a specific melodic way. So here I think contextually you have to remember that. Poetry in a specific melodic way. And listening to it is also disliked, unless it is from a non-mahram woman, in which case enjoying it becomes haram. Similarly, it is prohibited if accompanied by instruments of amusement, due to the impermissibility associated with those instruments themselves. So if, as Imam Ibn Qudama mentions, among the varying different categories that some would say it's mubah, or it's makruh, or it's haram, if it is associated with musical instruments, or it is a woman that's singing to men, then in those scenarios, and this is also something Imam al-Ghazali mentions, then in those scenarios it's impermissible based on the circumstances, the context of which it's being done. Al-Buhuti also expounds, as Ibn Qudama did, when he says, if someone engages in any of these disgraceful acts in private, then his testimony is not to be rejected because his dignity, his muru, is not nullified by that. Meaning nobody's witnessed it. He's done it and concealed it. And the same applies if he did it once or a very small amount where people did come into knowledge of that. It wouldn't undermine his standing. Okay, so we can see here the madhab pretty much is what it was during the time of Ibn Qudama, because Imam al-Buhuti is in the mutaakhirin, the later phase of the school. Ibn Qudama is in the middle era of the school, right? Ibn Qudama passed away in 620. Al-Buhuti passed away in yeah, 1050, right? 1050. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. 1050. So, hundreds of years of development of the madhab, and by and large, the rulings are still the same, especially when it comes to this particular issue, minus maybe one nuance here or there. But in general, you can see it is as it has been here. And I mention that so we understand that the issue has been one that's been tackled. It's not that all of a sudden we're making this up now, or we're changing things now, or we're introducing these concepts now for some reason because music has become so filthy, etc. No, they were talking about this very early on, in the very early days, as we can see even during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, because that's the legal codes that are built upon his way. And they have been passing down that way and codifying into law over the era, and now we are where we are, and it is as it has been. So it's not, oh, all of a sudden you guys are just saying now you can't do these things, you can't do these things. No, these are things that can never be done, and we often get confused by this or concerned with it. It's because it's so widespread. It's almost like it's flipped upside down. Night is now day, and day is now night. And so it's hard to imagine when you're outside and you're looking at the moon, and somebody's been told that's the sun their whole life, and you come and say, no, that's the moon. They're going, wait a minute, everybody's been saying that that's the sun. They're acting as if that's the sun, and you're going, no, it's not, that's the moon. It's always been the moon. It's never actually been the sun. But because of the overwhelming practice of many people for a long period of time, eventually, if you're not like in tune and up to date with, or I should say not up to date, but up with the past and the way of the Prophet ﷺ, then yeah, it will be an issue where you just think, man, this is harsh. Why are these people being harsh? Not the case. It's just the other side is being extremely negligent. And so coming into the middle seems harsh. When you've gone so far off onto the left, coming back to the middle seems like a stretch. He says also, Imām al-Buhuti, permissible, however, is al-Hida. With dhamma, he says, on the ha, though it's also said with a kasra. That is the chanting used to urge camels forward. The same ruling applies to all forms of poetic chanting, as long as it does not cross the boundary into singing. Poetic chanting is permissible as long as it does not cross the boundary into singing. We know the difference between reciting a poem and now singing or making a melody with the voice. The Prophet ﷺ has said, indeed, some poetry contains wisdom. And the Prophet ﷺ would place a mimbar for Hassan ibn Thabit, radiallahu anhu, the great poet of the Prophet ﷺ. And he would climb on that pulpit, the mimbar, Hassan ibn Thabit, and he would recite poetry, either in praise of the Prophet ﷺ or to satirize those who had insulted the Prophet ﷺ. Because back then poetry was like, it was like the rap battle of today. Maybe perhaps even more of a thing in the community. Right? And so they would go back and forth with their poets, and there would be a victor. I mean, there would be a loser, there would be a winner. And so Hassan ibn Thabit was assigned to take up this responsibility of defending the faith and as well as promoting the Prophet ﷺ through his poetry. So that wraps up that part from Sharh Muntal Iradat by Imām Buhuti. And that also concludes this section on the witnessing. So we got to see from Ibn Qudamah as well as Imām al-Buhuti what the legal code has to say about singing when it comes to a person's witness. Another thing that singing has an impact on is trade and employment contracts. Right? I could have just given you what the ruling is, just the general ruling, and say this is what the scholars say about singing, based on what the Prophet ﷺ said and their conclusions of that. I could have just given you the ruling. And normally I would do that. In all the other settings, that's what we've done. We've talked about this a handful of times over the years, and I just give you the basic summary of what the ruling is, especially within the Hanbali school. Sometimes I'll highlight the other schools of thought as well, just to be thorough. But this time, I thought it was important to highlight the impact that it has, the real-world impact within our legal code, so we can see the gravity of this behavior. It's not just an isolated act that you do, but within our legal code, our tradition, it has an impact on more than just the act in and of itself. As we saw, now you've jeopardized your witness. Your testimony's been jeopardized. Now it has an impact on trade and commerce and employment contracts. Ibn Qudamah writes in the chapter of Ijara, it's not permissible to contract a lease for prohibited uses such as singing or wailing, niyaha. That's what's done in the funerals. Or playing wind instruments. It's not permissible to contract a lease, meaning you can't hire somebody. You can't hire, it's an invalid contract. It's impermissible and it's invalid, the contract, to hire somebody to do this. You cannot employ somebody for haram things, prohibited uses. Nor is it permissible to lease one's home to someone who will use it as, keep this in mind. He's going to list things. Keep the nature of these things in mind and see how clear they are in your mind. Okay? It's impermissible to lease one's home, or let's say one's property. Let's widen the scope, because it would be the same thing. It's not our homes that we're leasing out for spaces, but it is our commercial property that we lease out for spaces at times, for those that own commercial property. It's impermissible to lease one's property to someone who will use it as a church. Imagine that. Muslim owns a building, leasing it out for a church so that people can come worship Jesus. What are you doing? Or Beit Nar, a fire temple, so that they can come worship the fire. Or they own a property, they hire, they lease it out to the Hindus across the street so they can come worship their gods. Or a venue, they hire it out as a venue to sell wine. Imagine that. There's one down the road here. There's two actually, close to us. One this way, one that way. Commercial property that's being rented by a company. There used to be one here. It's changed now. The one down here might still be here. Where they either sell or they produce wine. And they have wine tastings every once in a while. They used to. Right, so if the Muslim owned that building, it's impermissible for him to contract those types of things. Because the activity is forbidden, so the lease for its performance is also invalid. Just like leasing a bondwoman for fornication. Likewise, it is not permissible to hire someone to write songs or laments or anything that is impermissible for the purpose of that impermissibility. Right, so the first things that we listed, they all seem rather like normal within the average Muslim listener or Muslim community member. At least I would hope that that would seem normal. Can I lease out my building for a church? Can I lease out my building for a Hindu temple? Can I lease out my building so that they can start a winery? Can I lease out my building for a brothel? I would hope that, you know, most people would understand, like, yeah, that doesn't even seem morally sound. I don't know about the legal ruling, but I know morally that just doesn't feel right to me. Inside it doesn't feel right to me. Right? There's a little iman in there that makes me feel shy about that and embarrassed. I'd hate for somebody to ask me, hey, I just saw somebody move into your building. Who are they? And you go, oh, it's a winery. I would be embarrassed by that, right? And then, likewise, it's not permissible to hire out somebody to write songs, etc. Sharh Muntaha al-Iradat. We jump up now to the next era of the leaders in the madhab. Imām al-Wāsiṭī says it's not permissible to sell a male or female bondservant to someone known that will engage in sodomy or for being involved in singing. Why is he putting them right there like this? You remember Ibn Qudama, he talked about music and intoxicants. He put them in the same line together. He coupled the impermissibility of, he said, the impermissibility of musical instruments is like that of alcohol. It's not a random thought to put that there like that. That's my point to you. Is when the imams that are the imams of this level, these are leaders in the tradition. They are leaders in the Islamic sciences, not just like hobbyists here. They're leaders in critical legal analysis. When they are penning their manuals, they're being selective about what words and the order of those words. And so when he says this here, singing as a profession, and then couples that, like if they hire a female slave or a male slave for engaging in sodomy, which all of us know that's impermissible, it's haram, even it's repugnant, or for being involved in singing as a profession, meaning I'm going to hire a male or a female slave or servant in order to do that as a profession. It's impermissible. And he mentions a verse in the Quran, وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ شَدِيدُ الْعِقَابِ. Do not assist one another in sin and transgression. Fear Allah, for indeed Allah is severe in punishment. And because this constitutes a contract over an item that will be used for disobeying Allah, so it is invalid, just like hiring out a female slave for fornication or singing. Again, he mentions that again. Then in the chapter of Ijara, he says a lease is not valid for purposes involving fornication, playing instruments, singing, wailing, copying heretical books, composing forbidden poetry, herding pigs, or anything similar. Because a forbidden benefit cannot be assigned monetary value in a sale. And likewise, it cannot be the subject of a valid lease. Ibn Mundhir reported consensus, ijma' on this ruling regarding the female singer al-Mughanniya and the mourner an-Na'iha. So there you go. It's an impact on on business. The impact on business. So first we did the impact of singing and music on testimony. And then we did business transaction, leases and sales. We're not done. It's not over. The ripple effect of it will continue to the next chapter in the legal books, Bab al-Ḥajr, which is legal interdiction. A person may be legally interdicted for his own protection due to one of three reasons. This means their finances can be frozen. Number one is they're a minority. Number two, insanity. And number three, safa, foolish, safi. This is based on the statement of Allah, وَبَتُلُوا الْيَتَامَ حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغُوا النِّكَاحَ فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا فَادْفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُم. And this is found in Surah An-Nisa, verse number 6. Test the orphans until they reach marriageable age. Then, if you perceive in them sound judgment, deliver their wealth to them. This indicates that wealth is not to be handed over to them prior to establishing rushd, which would be financial soundness. Right? So the person that is managing their wealth is going to take care of it for them on their behalf. He's not just going to give them free access to their wealth, to a child. You know what my kid would do if I gave them all of the money? How many marshmallows and things we would have in the house? I mean, like stuffed animals. I mean, you know, there'd be no end to that. Another verse in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تُؤْتُوا السُّفَهَاءَ أَمْوَالَكُمُ الَّتِي جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ قِيَامًا وَارْزُقُوهُمْ فِيهَا وَاكْسُوهُمْ وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Again, Surah An-Nisa, this is the next verse, or the previous verse, number 5. Do not entrust the foolish. وَلَا تُؤْتُوا السُّفَهَاءَ أَمْوَالَكُمْ. Do not entrust the foolish with your wealth. الَّتِي جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ قِيَامًا. The wealth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made a means of support for you. قِيَامًا وَارْزُقُوهُمْ فِيهَا. But feed and clothe them from it. وَاكْسُوهُمْ وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Right? So you use that wealth in order to take care of them, to provide for them. It's their wealth. You use that money that's theirs to give them food, to give them clothing, to give them shelter. And then, of course, you speak to them kindly. So allowing them free reign in financial transactions leads to a loss of their wealth. And this causes harm. Right? And in Islam we have la darara wa la dirar. There's no harm or reciprocation of harm. And from the overarching objectives, the maqasid al-sharia is hifdh al-mal, is to preserve wealth, to safeguard wealth, to manage and take care of wealth. That's one of the five overarching aims and objectives of the Islamic law. One of them is to preserve and safeguard wealth. And so in this case, when someone is going to cause themselves harm by way of their wealth, interdiction is prescribed. Someone's involved. That's why there's a person that takes care of a child's wealth. Or someone that's lost their mental faculty. Someone has to take care of their wealth. Who manages the wealth during this interdiction? The father manages the wealth of the minor and the insane. Because this is a form of wilaya over one who lacks capacity. In matters of guardianship, the father is given precedence just like he is in wilayatun nikah. That means when the girl's going to get married, the father it's his job. It's his role to do that. After him, he appoints an executor. He makes a wasiyah. So the wasi will assume the role because he's acting as the father's representative, or like an agent, a wakil, he might appoint somebody after that. If there's no one like that and the father's passed away, it's the hakim. The judge now assumes control because kinship or guardianship here has ceased. And the role returns to the authority or the ruler, as is the case of marriage. No one besides them may assume control of the person's wealth, because wealth is the locus of betrayal. It's the center of betrayal, and others lack both sufficient compassion and reliability. Therefore, a stranger is not entrusted with this guardianship. And there are conditions to such guardianship, and one of those conditions is adala, being upright. And what we say can impact your adala? Getting involved in that. So the validity of such guardianship is upright character, their adala, and this is by unanimous agreement. Because entrusting a fasiq with such a responsibility leads to the loss of wealth and is therefore impermissible, just like entrusting it to a safi, a fool. So the next chapter here, right after this portion, on the definition of rushd and how it's recognized. Rushd refers to soundness in financial matters, as I described earlier. And this is based on the statement of Ibn Abbas, when he said that if you perceive in them sound judgment, rushd, right? This rushd here is talking about financial matters. He said, radiyallahu anhu, it means rectitude in managing their wealth. So the legal interdiction, the ḥajr, is imposed to protect a person's wealth. So it is lifted when financial responsibility is proven, just as interdiction is lifted for one who becomes morally upright. Okay? So when a child can prove financial literacy and capacity to control themselves and manage their wealth, they've proven that they're Rashid. They have rushd. Or a person who was morally lost. When they prove that, that the adl there, the interdiction, is lifted as well. And since the fasiq behavior, sinful conduct, is a matter which, if it arises after rushd is established, does not necessitate interdiction, then it does not preclude the rushd in the first place, just as illness does not. He says, however, if the individual's sinful conduct leads to the destruction of his wealth, such as by purchasing wine, spending it on singing, or gambling. Again, keep in mind the things that are mentioned together here. Purchasing wine. Someone that's buying wine. Non-Muslims know that. Non-Muslims know. Muslims don't drink and they don't eat pork. You ask them, what do Muslims not do? Well, they don't drink and they don't eat pork. I mean, you can go down south and they'll probably tell you that as well. Because down there they do a lot of drinking and eating a lot of pork. You know what I mean? Gambling as well. Most Muslims know you can't gamble. And then right in the middle, spending it on singing. He says, then he is not considered Rashid. They're engaged in buying wine, paying for songs and going to concerts, etc., spending their money on these performances, and then spending their money on gambling, and they're not considered Rashid because they're corrupting their wealth. Imām al-Bahuti, he says, in a similar chapter here regarding testing the sound judgment of a youth, he says, and along with what has already been mentioned, his sound judgment is also to be assessed by whether he refrains from spending all that is in his possession on that which has no benefit, such as buying oil to burn for amusement. Like a kid, like, I'm going to go buy a bunch of firecrackers, Or similar wasteful acts. Or spending it on what is prohibited. So buying oil is not impermissible. But buying it to burn it for amusement is wasteful. Or spending it on what is prohibited, such as gambling, singing, or purchasing forbidden items like musical instruments or wine. Here, Imām al-Bahuti says, he lumps singing with what is prohibited. Remember before we said makruh, and it's poetic, it's reciting poetry in a rhythmic tone. Now he's lumping it with things that he's considered impermissible. And this is because, based on common custom, a person who spends his wealth in such ways is considered foolish. It's considered Sufi. And is considered wasteful. And this is one of the things that is considered in interdiction, in Hajr. Are they being foolish with their wealth? A person can be considered foolish for spending in permissible things. So what about when it comes to spending and impermissible things? And then, not even there, one more, and then we're going to stop. One more point to be mentioned here after mentioning, what did we say again? Recap. We said testimony and witness. We said business contracts, leases, etc. Wages, earning a wage. We talked about now what? Interdiction, a ḥajr, basically freezing assets. And the next thing, in the chapter of Janazah, Imām al-Bāhūtī mentions that it's prohibited to seek treatment with something forbidden. Meaning you can't seek medical treatment with the haram. Seeking medical treatment is permissible. Taking medicine is permissible. But seeking to medicate with the impermissible is haram. Right? Today they're prescribing all kinds of, and we're getting dispensaries pop up everywhere in South Jersey. Right? In the last year, we've had like 5 or 6 dispensaries open up right around us, selling weed, you know? Yeah. Ganja, yeah. So that's a physical substance. Or alcohol, for example. Doctors will tell you, a glass of wine a day is good for you. It's got antioxidants in it. That's good for you. Have a glass of wine a day. That's healthy. Doctor might tell you that. Have a glass of wine a day. It's good for your body. It's medicinal. It's haram. You can't do it. Just because the doctor said it's good for you, it's going to help you out. It's haram to do. You can't seek medical treatment with the impermissible. Even with the sound of musical instruments, he says. Yeah, as it falls under the general ruling of the statement, do not seek treatment with what is unlawful. Poetic alluded to that, and we mentioned that before. Right, so that gives you an idea of how music, singing especially, right? Forget musical instruments. We don't need to discuss that any further. That's obvious. I think that's obvious. There are clear ahadith about that, and I've mentioned those to you more than one time. And the general consensus among the scholars about the conclusion of those hadith establishing a ruling about musical instruments, whether it's a wind instrument or a string instrument, it is in the same category. It's a musical instrument. The only exception that they make for musical instruments is the drum, a duf, which is the wood-rimmed drum. And those are utilized in certain scenarios. They're permitted during Eid, for example, or weddings, or, as I mentioned, circumcision, or like a return of a traveler. Those types of celebratory moments that you might pull that out to play. But singing is the issue where that you find that the people, they have various different views and opinions. But here we can see, and we talked about those from the Hanafi madhab, the Malikis, the Shafis, and now we've looked at musical instruments, we've looked at singing, we looked at Hida, the chanting for the camels, we looked at poetry, we looked at dancing a little bit. Clapping is the same way, by the way. If it's associated with something impermissible, it becomes that way. And this is all within the Hanbali school, not only within the frameworks of the middle era, the leader of them being Ibn Qudama, but also later in the latter era by with Ibn Najjar in his Muntal Iradat via Imām al-Bāhūtī in his explanation of that great work. So with that in mind, the reason that we went over this is not only to help everybody understand the impact of it, and that it's not just something that is in and of itself impermissible, but it has a tangible negative outcome. Besides the sin that's incurred for those that believe it's and are convinced that it's impermissible or that it's disliked, it has a tangible outcome across the board in various different scenarios. Right? So it's a very real issue. It's not one of those little things that's like, oh, just throw that under the rug. It's not. It's a little thing. It's a little thing. No, it has an impact. And this I wanted to cover also, not only that, for that reason, but also, I think it's evident now, if we look at Imām al-Wāsiṭī's reflections in his treatise that tonight the book launch, for those that are here, you can go back and you can see what he has to say about some of these things. For example, on page number 18, if you have the book with you, you can jot these things down or quickly reference them. There are 3 things to which natural temperaments are reactive and by which they become intoxicated. Samāʿ, Those are the singing sessions right there. Physical form, meaning like beauty, and wine. He also addresses what's often accompanied with these gatherings, poetic verses that inflame the hearts and stir the appetites. On page number 28, you can see him talking about some of the poetry that they would use during these gatherings, stirring up a person's lusts and desires, mentioning Layla, Su'da, Lubna, talking about cheeks, stately forms, graceful sides of the body, bosoms. They were using all these types of poems in order to use them as metaphors. But what it was really doing is elucidating with, or I should say, inciting within people lust and desire. And then, of course, on page number, a little bit further down, 38, he talks about how the gatherings with singing was also done with the young boys that were gazed upon with lustful desire. And then he talks about, on the following page, number 39, I believe, he talks about the ruling of it when there's a woman performing in front of men, and discusses the impermissibility of that across the board. And then, of course, if you go back to the beginning, page 8 and page number 10, he talks about the issue of samāʿ as an act of worship, and it means drawing near to Allah. So altogether, now that you have the book, you can go through that and reference that. This is like a sit down and read in one session type of a book. You can understand now and perhaps see Imām al-Wāsiṭī's conclusions. They match the general Hanbali stance on the issue based on what he said and what we've come to understand. From the degree of his denunciation of these gatherings, it can be inferred that the people of his time, obviously, emulating their leaders and imams and their, I should say, their shayukh, even those shayukh, those are the ones that were engaging in these actions. And at the very least, the shaykh, this is what we're talking about here, the shaykh of the tariqah, what he was engaging in, at the very least would be considered Sufi, frivolous, and a collapse of moral integrity. This is suqut al-muru'ah. And that would nullify their uprightness, their adala, and disqualify them from being religious leaders. That's number one. And if we really dig into how dark it got in some of those circles, then we would see it was not just about suqut al-muru'ah or being Sufi, about frivolity, but they were severe acts, sinful in nature, shameful and forbidden, which would demand not only censure, but disciplinary measure. Forget about something that's disliked. We're talking about major impermissible activities. And that's where we're going to wrap up for this evening. I appreciate your attendance and attentive listening. Jazakallah khair. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana.